Hello, this is Cantor David Montefiore. Join me in welcoming Dr. Jennifer Schneider, who brings to us her views of Parsha Pinchas, this week's Torah portion, vis-a-vis what is going on in our country today and the parallels between Moshe Rabbeinu and George Washington. The title of her talk is The Transfer of Power.
Okay. So last weekend, 266,000 people in the US downloaded the Disney Plus app. And most of them watched, as I did, the Broadway musical Hamilton. Anybody here watched it?
No.
Okay. Still on. I realized as I was watching it that I knew very little about American history. So I began reading the biography in which it was based by Ron Chernow. I also did a little reading online about George Washington, and I found some things he did that I could relate to this week's parasha. So let's start with George Washington, the first American president. He was a general during the War of Independence and later presided over the Constitutional Convention of 1787. In 1789, he was elected, and he served 8 years. He set enduring precedents for the office of president, including the title Mr. President, which really impressed me. I mean, it is a very not fancy title. His farewell address set a precedent for many of our recent presidents. In Washington's case, it was actually a letter he wrote as a valedictory to, quote, friends and fellow citizens, end quote, after 20 years of public service to the United States. He wrote it near the end of his second term of presidency in September 1796, a few weeks before the forthcoming election for a new president, with the help of Alexander Hamilton, who wrote most of it. It was published in a newspaper. In it, he warns Americans of the political dangers which they must avoid if they are to remain true to their values. He begins his warnings to the American people by stressing that their independence, peace at home and abroad, safety, prosperity, and liberty are all dependent upon unity among the states. He reminds people that it is the right of the people to alter the government to meet their needs, but it should only be done through constitutional amendments. He reinforces this belief by arguing that violent takeovers of the government should be avoided at all costs, and that it is the duty of every member of the Republic to follow the Constitution and to submit to the laws of the government until it is constitutionally amended by the majority of American people. Washington had a big role in creating the Constitution of the United States, and after 20 years of service and leadership, he focused when he left on the need for law and order, and he demonstrated a peaceful transition to a new leader. Moses was a leader for double Washington's tenure, at least 40 years. So he was very used to being in charge. But then, and this was in chapter 27, verse 12 to 13, the Lord said to Moses, ascend these heights of Abarim and view the land that I've given to the Israelite people. When you have seen it, you too shall be gathered to your kin, just as your brother Aaron was. Well, naturally, Moses was worried about who would take charge. And it says in verse 17, so that the Lord's community may not be like sheep that have no shepherd. God then tells Moses, verse 18 to 21, single out Joshua, son of Nun, and lay your hand upon him. Have him stand before Eleazar the priest and before the whole community, and commission him in their sight. Invest him with some of your authority, so that the whole Israelite community may obey. But he shall present himself to Eleazar the priest who shall on his behalf seek the decision of the Urim before the Lord. Well, this process would set a precedent of bringing about a peaceful transfer of power, delineating the chain of command. Relevant to this is that God did not choose a son of Moses to take his place, unlike in kingdoms, right, where automatically the son or whatever becomes the head, but rather someone whom he believed would be the best leader. This in itself exemplified a different approach to the transfer of power. And after that, God handed out a series of other instructions about daily offerings, Shabbat offerings, and for the special days like the Festival of Unleavened Bread and the Feast of Weeks and the New Moon, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot. So it says in verse 22, Moses did as the Lord commanded him. Well, after 40 years of power, Moses was ready to peacefully leave. And Moses did leave, setting an important precedent. When I was reading about Washington's precedent-setting departure, I thought about this connection with Moses. It's interesting that at the end, of Deuteronomy, Moses also gives a State of the Nation speech, summarizing what had happened and what will or should happen to the 12 tribes. Currently in this country, there seems to be an increasing amount of violence. Some of this may be due to our current plague, which is leaving millions of people fearing for their life and health. People without jobs, without order in their lives, and with great uncertainty. We lack a sense of unity and effective leadership in getting through this crisis. Too many people act impulsively, jumping at solutions that only make things worse. Law and order, unity, the concepts exemplified by the late life actions of Moses and Washington are all too often not a priority. We need a major shift in priorities in this country. Relevant to this discussion is a very thoughtful D'var Torah for this parasha titled Moral versus Political Decisions, written by Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, which I highly recommend. I very much agree with his thought process. He began by asking the question, how far should governments go in seeking to prevent the spread of coronavirus? How far should it go in imposing a clampdown of businesses? He observed that nearly every country has adopted social distancing and lockdown until the incidence of new cases has reached its peak. Regardless of cost, these nations placed the saving of life above all other considerations, said Sachs. And he said also, this was a moment victory for the value first articulated in the Torah, in Genesis chapter 9, verse 6, which said, he who sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God he created man. This was the first declaration of the principle that human life is sacred. But of course, historically, not all human life is sacred, only those that fit the image we or God have in our minds. Sachs noted that in the ancient world, economic considerations took precedence over life. In contrast, the fact that almost all of the nations in the face of the pandemic chose life was a significant victory for the Torah's ethic of the sanctity of life, said Sachs. Well, the story of Pinchas is very relevant to this discussion. In the previous chapter, which was chapter 24, we learned that God was so angry with all of the Israelites who were consorting with Midianite women and some even worshiping their gods, that he killed 24,000 Israelites. And it doesn't say how he killed them. It also uses the word plague in the next chapter, but apparently, who knows, but he killed them. All right. Pinchas, a zealous and fanatic person, who is the son of the high priest Eleazar and the grandson of Aaron, killed one such couple, the Israelite Zimri, and the Midianite woman Cosby, who also happened to be, both of them happened to be the children of some big political people. God then said, Pinchas has turned back my anger from the Israelites by being zealous among them on my behalf, so that I did not wipe out the Israelite people in my zeal. Therefore, I am making with him my covenant of peace. So instead of punishing Pinchas, God rewarded him by making him an everlasting big priest and granting him a pact of friendship. So the idea is that by killing 2 people, Pinchas saved thousands of others from God's wrath. As Sachs said, Pinchas was not acting on moral principle. He was making a political decision. Instead, he acted on what would later be known as Mishpat Melech, which means the king's justice or sentence. Better to take 2 lives immediately, people who eventually would have been sentenced to death by the court, to save thousands now. And he was right, as God later made clear. That's what Sachs said. And he also said, we have moral duties as individuals, and we make political decisions as nations. The 2 are very different. That's what the story of Pinchas is about. It also explains the tensions in governments during the pandemic. And this is still Sachs talking. I have to give him credit. I was very impressed. We have a moral commitment to the sanctity of life, but we also have a political commitment, not just to life, but also to liberty and the pursuit of happiness. Sachs concludes that he's happy that most nations chose to put moral considerations ahead of political ones until the danger began to recede. Okay? So, as I see it, the ongoing tension in many countries right now between opening up and continuing isolation is exactly an example of moral versus political. And the decisions about morality keep shifting. In 1777, Washington faced his own Bamidbar. The Continental Avenue encamped at Valley Forge that autumn had within its ranks about 12,000 men. Death that winter claimed about a quarter of his soldiers before spring arrived. So Washington made a political decision for American liberty at the cost of loss of many lives. But a short time later, he and his men forced the British from the field at the Battle of Monmouth. Valley Forge proved to be the turning point of the war.
I hope you enjoyed Dr. Jennifer Schneider's talk on this week's Parsha Pinchas. Please join us each and every Shabbat morning on Zoom at 10 a.m. Arizona time. This is Cantor David Montefiore saying, Shavua Tov.